The morning Tobias Quinn spent his last $4 on a stagecoach ticket he didn't need. He told himself it was simply good sense to travel in comfort, rather than ride another 100 miles through the Arizona dust on the back of a borrowed horse. He told himself that so convincingly that he almost believed it, right up until the moment he saw Violet Ford step onto the boarding platform at Tucson station, and every lie he'd been feeding himself dissolved like sugar in rain. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Arizona Territory was the kind of place that chewed men up and spat them out without so much as an apology. The sun over Tucson had no mercy in it. It beat down on the adobe buildings and the dirt-packed streets with the indifference of something ancient and unknowable, and the people who lived beneath it had a certain weathered quality, a hardness around the eyes that came not from cruelty but from surviving. Tobias had been surviving for 26 years, and he wore that quality well. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that had grown a little too long at the collar, and eyes the color of creek water after a storm, a greenish-gray that shifted depending on the light. He had the kind of face that was better suited to looking out at long distances than to social situations, and most people who met him assumed he was a man of very few words. They were not entirely wrong. But that morning, watching Violet Ford cross the sun-bleached planks of the platform with a worn leather traveling bag in one hand and a hatbox balanced in the other, Tobias Quinn found that words were not the problem. The problem was that there were too many of them pressing up behind his teeth, and not a single one of them was the right one to say to a woman he hadn't seen in 14 months. Violet Ford was 23 years old, and she had the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself immediately. It crept up on you. She was not the flashy sort of pretty that men hollered about outside saloons. She was something quieter and more lasting than that. She had dark brown hair that she wore pinned up beneath a practical straw hat, and her skin had been kissed brown by the sun in that way that proper ladies in the eastern cities would have considered scandalous. Her eyes were the deep, warm amber of good whiskey held up to firelight, and they missed absolutely nothing. She had a way of looking at things, at people, that made you feel as though she were reading the fine print of you, the parts you'd never meant anyone to see. Tobias had first met Violet 14 months ago in the town of Sagebrush Creek, which was precisely the sort of town its name suggested. Dry, scratchy, and clinging to existence by the thinnest of roots. He'd ridden in as a hired hand for a cattle operation that had since gone belly up, and Violet had been running the general store that her father had left her when he died of a fever the previous winter. She'd been 22 then, and already running the business with the quiet competence of someone twice her age, negotiating with supply wagons, keeping the books, managing the credit accounts of half a dozen ranching families who were always 3 months behind on their payments. He'd gone in for coffee beans and a spool of wire, and he'd come out 2 hours later having talked more than he normally talked in a week. She had a way of drawing conversation out of people without seeming to try. She asked questions that weren't intrusive but somehow got right to the heart of things, and she listened to the answers with her full attention, none of that polite half-listening that most people substituted for genuine interest. He'd gone back the next day for supplies he hadn't actually needed, and the day after that. By the third week, he was manufacturing reasons to visit the store so transparent that old Chester Wills, who sat on a barrel outside the barber shop and observed the comings and goings of Sagebrush Creek as his primary occupation, had started making pointed remarks that Tobias had chosen to ignore. They'd spent those weeks in a kind of slow, careful dance. Talking over the counter, walking to the edge of town in the evenings when the light turned everything gold and soft. She'd told him about her father, about growing up in Missouri before the family moved west, about her dreams of one day traveling to San Francisco, which she described with such specific and detailed longing that he understood she'd been reading about it for years. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about the brother he'd lost to typhoid when they were boys, About the ranch in Texas he'd grown up on that had been sold off when his father's gambling debts finally came due. About the years he'd spent drifting from one hired job to another without any particular destination in mind. He'd been on the edge of saying something important to her, something that would have moved them from the careful dance into something more definite, when the cattle operation he was working for collapsed without warning. The owner, a man named Hutchins, had borrowed from the wrong people and disappeared one night rather than face the consequences, leaving his entire operation in disarray and his hired hands without wages or work. Tobias had been owed 6 weeks of pay that he was never going to see. He'd gone to the store to tell her he had to leave, that he had no money to stay and no way to make any in a town that was already struggling, and the conversation had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Violet had stood very still while he explained, and when he was done she'd looked at him with those amber eyes that read fine print and said, quietly, that she understood, and that she hoped he'd find what he was looking for. She hadn't asked him to stay, because she wasn't the sort of woman who asked for things she thought might be asking too much. He hadn't asked her to wait, because he was the sort of man who believed he had nothing to offer a woman worth waiting for. They'd shaken hands like two people ending a business transaction, which was so absurd given what had actually passed between them that Tobias had thought about it approximately 400 times in the 14 months since. He'd gone to Prescott, then to Flagstaff, then had spent nearly 8 months on a cattle drive up through New Mexico that had paid decently and left him with enough to consider his options. And his options had led him, with what he now recognized as embarrassingly little mystery to himself, directly back to Tucson, which was the last city of any size before the road south that would take him back through the territory where Sagebrush Creek sat. He had not planned to take the stagecoach. He had planned to ride, but the horse he'd hired had thrown a shoe 2 days back, and the farrier in Tucson was backed up until tomorrow, and the stagecoach to Benson left this morning, and Benson was only 15 miles from Sagebrush Creek, and the stagecoach to Benson left this morning. He'd been in the station office buying his ticket when through the grimy window he'd seen Violet Ford appear on the platform, and his hand had been writing out his name on the ticket slip before his brain had entirely caught up. There was one seat left. He'd bought it. Now he stood at the edge of the platform, his hat in his hand because the shade of the overhang meant he didn't need it, and he watched her settle her bags and look out at the street with that particular expression she had that meant she was thinking about something more complex than the surface of things showed. He'd forgotten how well he remembered her expressions, or perhaps he'd never actually forgotten. Perhaps they'd been sitting in the back of his mind for 14 months, perfectly preserved. He walked over. There was no elegant way to do it, no clever approach, so he just walked over the way he'd always done things, directly and without ceremony, and said, "Miss Ford." She turned, and the expression that moved across her face was one of the most complicated things he'd ever witnessed. Surprise first, genuine and wide-eyed, and then something warmer that she caught and held back before it could become too visible, and then a smile that was real but measured, the smile of a person who is being careful. "Mr. Quinn," she said, "I didn't expect to see you." "I wasn't expecting to be here either," he said. Which was one of the least honest things he'd ever said in his life, but it was all he had at the moment. "Are you headed south?" she asked. "Benson," he said. "So am I," she said. There was a pause that contained a significant amount of history. A man with 2 bags and a rifle case pushed past them on his way to the coach, and the driver was beginning to call out the final boarding, and Tobias said, "I suppose we'll be sharing the ride then." "I suppose so," said Violet Ford. The Tucson to Benson stagecoach was not a romantic conveyance. It was a dusty, jolting, cramped box on wheels pulled by 4 horses with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and the road it traveled was a suggestion more than a certainty. The interior seated 6 passengers if everyone was willing to make peace with their neighbors' elbows, and on this particular morning there were 5 other passengers beside Tobias and Violet. a heavy-set merchant from Illinois named Bergman, who immediately fell asleep and snored with impressive commitment. Two young men who turned out to be brothers named Castro, traveling to Benson to work at the silver mines. An older woman named Mrs. Whitmore, who wore black bombazine despite the heat, and had the air of someone attending a funeral that had lasted many years. And a railroad surveyor named Ashford who wanted to talk about grades and soil composition to anyone who would listen. Tobias had maneuvered, with more deliberate intention than he would ever admit, to sit beside Violet rather than across from her. The seat was tight, and the coaches swaying on the rough road meant that their shoulders came into contact regularly in a way that was technically accidental and practically unavoidable. He was acutely aware of every such contact. "Where are you coming from?" she asked, after the outskirts of Tucson had given way to the open desert, and the conversation between the other passengers had established its own separate current that didn't require their participation. "New Mexico," he said. "Cattle work. You?" "I've been to Tucson for supplies," she said. "Or needed restocking. I had to negotiate a new contract with the Alvarez brothers since the old supply arrangement fell through." She said it matter-of-factly, no drama in it, though he understood that negotiating contracts in Tucson as a woman alone was not the simple task she was making it sound. "The store is still running, then," he said. "Still running," she confirmed. "Better than it was a year ago, actually. I brought in a small lending library, books people can borrow for a nickel a week. It brings in a little additional income, but more importantly, it brings people in, and people who come in for books sometimes buy other things." He looked at her. "That's clever." She gave him a look that said she was aware it was clever and had not required his confirmation, but she said it mildly. "It was practical." He smiled, and she saw it, and something in her expression softened very slightly. They hit a rut in the road that threw most of the passengers sideways, and Mrs. Whitmore made a sound of deep personal offense, and the brothers Castro laughed and apologized simultaneously, and the moment passed into the general noise of the coach. But they kept talking. They talked the way they'd talked in Sagebrush Creek, in that easy, rolling way that didn't require effort, the conversation moving through topics like a river finding its natural course. She told him about a hard winter the territory had seen, about the difficulties that had come with it, about a family named Hargrove who'd lost most of their cattle to cold, and had relied on the store's credit for 3 months to get through. He told her about the cattle drive, about the vast flat emptiness of the Llano Estacado, about a thunderstorm they'd ridden through in eastern New Mexico that had been so spectacular it had stopped every man in the outfit cold just to watch. "I've never seen open country like that," she said. "Missouri was all trees and hills. Out here it's the opposite, more sky than you know what to do with." "Do you miss Missouri?" he asked. She considered this with the seriousness she gave to actual questions. "I miss the green," she said, "and I miss my mother who is still there, but I don't miss the smallness of it, of knowing everyone's opinion of you before you'd even formed one of yourself." She paused. "Out here there's room to be something that hasn't been decided yet." He understood that precisely and completely, because it was the same thing that had brought him west and kept him moving, the sense that in the openness of the territory a man was not yet fixed into a predetermined shape. He nodded, and she saw that he understood, and the look that passed between them was the kind that doesn't require words. The trouble started around midday. They were 2/3 of the way to Benson, rolling through a narrow passage between two rocky outcroppings that the locals called the Cut, when the coach slowed abruptly and then stopped. Tobias heard the driver exchange sharp words with someone outside, and the merchant Bergman woke from his snoring and looked around with the blinking confusion of the suddenly roused. "What is it?" asked Ashford the surveyor, leaning toward the window. Tobias was already looking. There were 3 men on horseback blocking the road ahead, and they were not men anyone would mistake for innocent travelers. They had the particular arrangement of hats and bandanas, and casual, confident posture of men who had done this before and expected it to go the same way it had gone before. "Road agents," Tobias said quietly. The word went through the coach like a cold draft. Mrs. Whitmore pressed her lips together so tightly they disappeared. The brothers Castro went very still. Violet, to her credit, did not make a sound, but Tobias felt her hand find the edge of the seat beside her, gripping it. Tobias had a Colt revolver on his hip, which he wore as a matter of routine rather than any particular expectation of trouble, and there was a Winchester rifle in the luggage rack above. He did a quick calculation that he suspected most men in his situation were making. 3 of them, one of him, a driver and a guard on top of the coach with probably a shotgun between them. The road agents likely knew there was a guard. They were positioned well. Taking this particular action would be a fool's errand that would get people hurt. He made a decision and leaned toward Violet. "If they start moving through the coach," he said, very low, "I want you to be looking at the floor." "Why?" she asked, equally low. "Because men like that make worse decisions when they think a woman is watching them," he said. She absorbed this. "That's a very specific piece of knowledge." "I've had a specific kind of experience," he said simply. What followed was tense and unpleasant, and ultimately, not as bad as it could have been. The men outside demanded the strongbox that the stage was carrying, which was the point of the whole exercise rather than robbing passengers, and after some shouting and a warning shot that made Mrs. Whitmore let out a sound like a stepped-on cat, the strongbox was handed over and the men rode off with it. The guard on top had a graze along his forearm from the warning shot that was angry-looking but not serious, and the driver bandaged it with a strip of cloth from somewhere, and they were moving again within 20 minutes. It was unpleasant and frightening and relatively brief, and in the aftermath of it, Violet Ford unclenched her hand from the seat and said, with perfect composure that Tobias suspected cost her something, "Well, that was educational." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am," she said, and then after a pause, "Thank you for the advice about looking at the floor. I did as you said." "I noticed," he said. Something in the way he said it made her look at him more carefully, and he looked back at her. And for just a moment neither of them was being careful or measured. He saw it in her eyes, that warmth she'd been managing since the platform, and he was sure she could see something equivalent in him. Then Bergman announced loudly that he had a flask and did anyone want a drink because by God he needed one, and the Castro brothers said yes enthusiastically, and the moment folded itself back up and was set aside, but it was not gone. It was simply waiting. They arrived in Benson in the late afternoon, the sun dropping low and orange over the San Pedro River Valley, turning the landscape into something almost unbearably beautiful. Benson was a growing town, busier than Sagebrush Creek, with the railroad survey activity bringing a constant influx of workers and engineers, and the businesses that followed them. The stage station was on the main street, and the passengers unfolded themselves from the coach with the careful movements of people who have been rattled around for several hours. Tobias helped Violet with her bags, handing them down from the luggage rack, and she accepted the help without the particular bristling that some women adopted in those years as a way of proving they needed nothing from anyone. She'd always been like that, he remembered. Knowing when to accept help was its own kind of practical intelligence. "I'll need to find lodging for the night," she said, looking down the street. "I'll ride back to Sagebrush Creek in the morning. Is there a decent boarding house here?" "Mrs. Calderon's on the next block," he said. He'd been in Benson once before, briefly. "She keeps a clean house and she's a fair cook." Violet gave him a look that he recognized as her reading fine print expression. "You seem to know Benson." "I passed through once." "I have a decent memory for practical details." He paused. "I was planning to ride to Sagebrush Creek in the morning as well. If you're agreeable, we could ride together. The road's straightforward, but it's better not to travel it alone." She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating exactly but thinking. "Is that where you're headed, Sagebrush Creek?" He met her eyes squarely. 14 months of half-honesty was enough. "Yes." "For work?" she asked. The question was very careful, Partly, he said. I heard Calloway's ranch is looking for hands. This was true. He had heard this. It was not, however, the primary reason. She held his gaze for another moment, and he had the sense that she was deciding something. Then she said, "All right, Mrs. Calderon's, you said." "Next block," he confirmed. She nodded, picked up her bag, and walked down the street. He watched her go, and then he picked up his own gear and followed, at a decent distance. Mrs. Calderon's was a long, low adobe building with a courtyard in the middle, and a kitchen that smelled gloriously of chili and roasted corn. Mrs. Calderon herself was a stout woman of about 50, with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that assessed you efficiently, and without judgment the moment you walked through her door. She had a room for Violet and a room for Tobias, and she served supper at 6, and yes, the horses could be kept in the back paddock. They ate supper in the common dining room with several other travelers. The food was excellent, and the conversation at the table was the pleasant, anonymous kind that happens among strangers who will never see each other again, easy and undemanding. Tobias sat across from Violet rather than beside her, which felt different from the coach in ways he was aware of. He could see her face more clearly. She ate with appetite, not performing delicacy, and she joined the general conversation with a naturalness that he found completely characteristic of her. After supper, the other travelers drifted off to their rooms or to the small parlor misses. Calderon kept for guests, and Tobias and Violet were left at the end of the table with their coffee, not quite done with the evening, not quite ready to say good night. "I should apologize," he said. She looked up from her coffee. "For what?" "For leaving the way I did," he said. "Last year. I know circumstances required it, but the circumstances were partly of my own making, and I've thought about it since." She was quiet for a moment. In the kitchen, Mrs. Calderon was humming something, and the sound of washing up came through the door. "You left because you had no work and no money," Violet said. "That seems like a reasonable cause for leaving." "It was a reasonable cause," he agreed. "It wasn't the whole of it. I also left because I was afraid." She looked at him steadily. The lamplight made her eyes very warm. "Afraid of what?" "Of asking you something that I had no right to ask," he said, "when I had nothing to offer you." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has a great deal going on inside it. A moth circled the lamp. Outside, somewhere down the street, a fiddle was playing, something slow and a little mournful. "You could have asked," she said finally. "I would have answered honestly." "I know," he said. "That's part of what frightened me." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The other part was that I didn't think a woman who had built something real, a business, a life, a place that was hers, should be asked to consider a man who had built nothing." Violet set her cup down with a precise, deliberate movement. "Tobias," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name since he'd arrived at that platform, and it landed on him like the first note of a song he'd been waiting to hear. "That is quite possibly the most backwards logic I've ever encountered from an otherwise sensible person." He blinked. "How so?" "Because the quality of what a person has built is not measured in property," she said. "I've known men who owned 1,000 acres and were worth nothing whatsoever, and I've known men who owned nothing but their character and were worth more than all of it." She looked at him directly. "I think you know which category you fall into." He looked at her for a long moment. The fiddle down the street played something slightly less mournful. "You're saying I underestimated myself." "I'm saying," she said with precision, "that you made an argument on my behalf without asking me, which is something I generally don't appreciate." "That's fair," he said. "It is," she agreed, but she was almost smiling. He leaned forward slightly. "Then let me ask now, since I didn't ask then. Is there anything here between us that I'm not inventing?" She held his gaze with the level, unhurried consideration that was entirely her. "No," she said. "You're not inventing it." He breathed out slowly. It felt like setting down something he'd been carrying for 14 months. "All right," he said. "Then I'd like, if you're willing, to stop being afraid of it." The smile broke through fully then, and it was not the careful, measured smile from the platform. It was the real one, unguarded, and it transformed her face into something that he was quite sure he had thought about nearly every day since he'd last seen it. "I think," she said, "that I am willing." They rode out of Benson the next morning with the sun still low, and the desert air cool enough to be a kindness after the previous day's heat. Tobias had borrowed a horse from Mrs. Calderon's paddock for the price of $1 and the promise to return it within a week, and Violet rode her own horse, a compact and sensible bay mare named Clara that she handled with the easy competence of someone who had been riding since childhood. The road to Sagebrush Creek was 15 miles of mostly flat ground with 2 dry creek crossings, and a stretch through some low hills where juniper and piñon grew, and the air smelled like something clean and ancient. They rode at a comfortable pace and talked, and the talking had a new quality to it now, lighter somehow, with less of the careful management they'd both been practicing. As if the conversation from the night before had removed a door they'd both been pressing their backs against. He told her about his plans, which were not elaborate but were real. He wanted to work for Callaway's operation for the season, save what he could, and begin the process of thinking about something more permanent. He was vague about what that permanent thing looked like, deliberately, because he did not want to presume. But she listened with that full attention of hers, and she asked about the particulars of Callaway's ranch, about the land near Sagebrush Creek, about what he thought of the territory's future now that the railroad was coming. She told him about the changes in Sagebrush Creek over the past year. The town had grown slightly, 2 new families having arrived to try their luck at small farming along the creek bottom. The saloon had changed hands twice, and was currently being run by a man named Donahue who was, by general agreement, an improvement on his predecessors. And old Chester Wills had finally stopped sitting on his barrel outside the barber shop, not because he'd retired from observation but because he'd moved inside, having found that the summer heat at his age was not worth the commentary. "He asked about you," she said. "Chester. He asked if I'd had word from the man who used to come into the store every day to buy things he clearly didn't need." Tobias felt the warmth in his face. "He said that." "He said quite a bit more than that," she said pleasantly. "Chester has opinions on most things. What did you tell him?" She looked at him sideways from under her hat brim, and there was a gleam in those amber eyes that he remembered and had sorely missed. "I told him I hadn't heard, which was true at the time. And now I suspect Chester will need to update his opinions," she said. The hills gave way back to open ground, and the town of Sagebrush Creek appeared in the middle distance, a modest scattering of buildings along the creek bed, the water bright and thin in the morning light. He felt, looking at it, something unexpected, the pull of familiarity, of a place that had taken on a meaning beyond its actual physical qualities, which were not particularly impressive. It was the meaning he'd given it. The meaning of where she was. The town greeted them with its ordinary morning business. A dog barked at the horses. 2 women in front of the dry goods building exchanged what appeared to be significant news. A boy of about 10 ran across the street for no apparent reason. And Chester Wills, visible through the window of the barber shop, looked up from his chair, took in the sight of the 2 of them riding down the main street together, and appeared to experience a deep and private satisfaction. Violet stabled Clara and went to open the store, and Tobias took the borrowed horse to the livery. And then, with his saddlebags over his shoulder and no particular place to be for another hour, he walked slowly down the main street and considered the situation with the honesty it deserved. He was 26 years old, had $4 and some change in his pocket, and was in a small desert town in the Arizona territory for the explicit purpose of being near a woman he'd been thinking about for 14 months. He had a lead on a job that might or might not materialize. He had no property, no significant savings, and no plan beyond the next immediate step. He also had, as of last night, the acknowledgement from Violet Ford that what was between them was not invented, which felt, at this particular moment in the Arizona morning, like a fortune. He found a room at the Sagebrush Creek Hotel, which was a generous name for a two-story building with 8 rooms and a tendency to let the heat in, and he went a call on Calloway's ranch that afternoon. The ranch was 3 miles from town, a working cattle operation of several thousand acres that was doing well by the standards of the territory. Calloway himself was a broad, red-faced man of about 50 who assessed Tobias in the way that ranchers assessed men who came looking for work, quickly and without sentiment, looking at hands and eyes and the way a man stood. He asked about experience, and Tobias told him about the New Mexico drive and the years before it, giving the facts plainly. Calloway asked if he could stay through the spring roundup. Tobias said he could. They agreed on wages that were honest without being generous, which was the way most such agreements went, and Tobias had work starting Monday. He went back to town and went to the store, because there was no good reason not to, and because the store was where Violet was, and that was the magnetic north of him now. The store smelled like coffee and sawdust and paper, and the late afternoon light came through the single large window in a long golden bar that lay across the wooden floor and the edge of the counter. Violet was behind the counter logging entries in the accounts book when he came in, and she looked up, and the quiet pleasure in her expression when she saw him was something he intended to keep looking at for as long as he was permitted to do so. "You got the position?" she asked, reading something in his face. "Starting Monday," he said. "Good wages, fair work. Calloway is a decent man," she said. "He treats his hands well from what I've heard. That's what I found. He came to lean against the counter in the way he'd done 14 months ago, the pose so comfortable and familiar that it settled around him like an old coat. I'll need to find better lodging than the hotel for a longer stay. Do you know anyone in town who takes boarders? Mrs. Greenway on 2nd Street takes 2 or 3, she said. She's quiet and her cooking is plain but good. I'd recommend her over the hotel. I'll go see her this evening." He paused. "Violet. I want to be straightforward about what I'm doing here, so there's no confusion." She closed the accounts book and gave him her full attention. The bar of golden light had shifted slightly, catching the edge of the hatbox she'd stored on the shelf behind her. "I came back because of you," he said. "The job at Calloway's is real and I intend to do it well, but it's not the reason I'm in Sagebrush Creek. I want you to know that because I think you deserve to have it said plainly rather than left to inference." She was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the plainness," she said. Then, after a pause that held something that might have been the result of its own courage, "I think I've been hoping you'd come back for some time." "How long?" he asked. "Longer than I would have admitted when you were still gone," she said. He smiled. "That sounds about right for both of us." She smiled too, and then there was a sound at the door as a customer came in, a rancher's wife looking for canning supplies, and the private moment gave way to the ordinary business of the afternoon. But he stayed and helped her shift a barrel of flour that needed moving, and they talked with comfortable ease around the customer's presence. And when he left in the early evening to find Mrs. Greenway and sort out his lodging, he felt light in a way that was entirely new and entirely welcome. The weeks that followed were some of the best he could remember. He worked at Calloway's from before dawn until the afternoon, doing the particular relentless physical labor of a working cattle ranch, mending fence lines and doctoring cattle and writing the long boundary checks, and doing the 100 practical tasks that most people who were not ranch hands had no idea consumed the days of those who were. It was hard work and honest work, and he was good at it, and Calloway noticed and said so, which was more than many bosses did. He came to town on his evenings off and on Sundays, and he spent those times with Violet. They established, almost without discussing it, a pattern that felt natural and right. Sunday afternoons he would come to the store and they would close it together at 5 o'clock and walk out along the creek where the cottonwoods grew, and the water made a sound that was the most peaceful sound in the territory, and they would talk until the light went. Evenings in the week, sometimes 2 or 3 times, he would stop by, and they would talk over the counter or he would sit in the chair she kept behind the lending library shelf, because reading customers sometimes needed to discuss what they were reading, and he would read while she worked, and it was a kind of quiet domesticity that suited them both deeply. He read 3 of her library books. She asked him about each of them with that genuine, interested attention of hers, and the conversations that came out of those discussions were some of the best they'd had, ranging across history and human nature, and the particular questions that books tend to raise when you take them seriously. She had a mind that moved quickly and wasn't afraid of conclusions, and she held her opinions firmly without being rigid about them, which he found extremely attractive. He took her to supper at the town's one decent restaurant one Saturday evening, which constituted the most formal occasion their relationship had yet seen, and he wore the cleanest shirt he owned, and she wore a blue dress that he had not seen before, and that did very specific things to his capacity for coherent thought. Old Chester Wills, who had apparently made an exception to his indoor policy for the evening and was seated on a bench outside, gave Tobias a long, significant look as they walked past, and Tobias tipped his hat to him in acknowledgment of his victory. At supper they talked about San Francisco, because she'd mentioned it again, the long-held dream of it, and he asked her to describe it. And she did, in the specific, loving detail of someone who had been building the image for years from books and newspaper accounts and letters from a cousin who had gone there 3 years back. The bridges, the bay, the hills, the incredible jumble of peoples from all corners of the world, the cable car lines they were building, the sense of a city being made in real time. "Do you think you'll go someday?" he asked. She looked at him over the table with those amber eyes. "I've thought about it," she said. "It seemed very distant a few months ago. Now it seems perhaps less so." He understood what she was saying with precision, and it set something in his chest to moving that he was careful not to let show too visibly, because they were in a restaurant, and Chester was probably watching through the window. He waited until they were walking back from the restaurant, in the cool of the evening with the stars coming out over the desert in their extravagant abundance, before he said the thing that had been building in him for weeks. He stopped walking. She stopped too, because she felt the change and looked at him. "I don't want to make the same mistake twice," he said. "The mistake of not saying what I mean because I'm afraid the timing isn't right or I'm not in a position to back it up yet." "All right," she said very quietly. The starlight was extraordinary. The creek made its sound in the distance. "I love you," he said. "I think I have been for most of the time I've known you. I know I don't have much yet, practically speaking. I have a good position at Callaway's and I'm working towards something more, but it's a work in progress and I'm aware of that. But I didn't want to wait until it was perfectly arranged before saying what's true right now." She looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was steady and warm and entirely certain. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying to be sensible about it for a year and a half and I'm not sure sensibility is doing either of us any good." He reached out and took her hand, which was small and capable and warm in his, and she stepped toward him, and he put his other arm around her, and she leaned into him in the way that people do when they have been held at a distance for too long and have finally been allowed to close it. They stood like that in the dark, under the wild and impossible Arizona stars, with the creek making its quiet sound and the lights of the town a warm glow behind them. He kissed her there in the starlight, and she kissed him back without hesitation, and it was the single best moment of Tobias Quinn's 26 years on the earth, bar nothing. Chester Wills, who had absolutely been watching from the restaurant window and had not remotely tried to pretend otherwise, was heard to say the next morning to anyone who would listen that it was about time, and he'd seen it coming from the start, and no one disputed him. The autumn deepened into winter, and winter passed with the peculiar gentleness that the Arizona desert gave to its cold months, cool and dry and clear, and Tobias and Violet moved through the season in the warm certainty of each other. He was at the ranch during the week and with her on his days off, and the time apart was not difficult so much as it was simply the structure of things to be worked through rather than dwelt upon. He was saving his wages carefully and with purpose. Callaway had mentioned, in passing, that there was a piece of land adjacent to his eastern boundary that might come available in the spring. 160 acres of decent ground with water access from the creek, and an existing but small and sturdy structure that had once been a line camp. It was not a fortune, but it was a beginning, and beginnings were what he understood best. He talked to Violet about it on a Sunday afternoon in February, sitting on the creek bank with the cottonwoods leafless around them and the water running clear over the stones. He laid it out the way he laid out everything, plainly and without embellishment, what the land was and what it would take, and what he thought could be done with it over time. He was careful to say what I think could be done rather than what we could do, because he was not yet in a position to make that larger statement, but he thought she heard the distinction and understood it. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "I want to show you something." She had brought in the canvas satchel she carried, a ledger book which surprised him. She opened it to a specific page and handed it to him. It was a savings account, meticulously kept, accumulated over 2.5 years of running the store. The amount was not enormous, but it was substantial, more than he had expected, more than most people in the territory could claim. "My father always said to keep a reserve," she said. "He said that security was the difference between choices and no choices. I've been keeping this because there was something I wanted to eventually do, but I was waiting to know what it was." He looked at the numbers and then at her. "Violet." "I'm not proposing anything," she said quickly, with a slight heightening of color that he found entirely charming. "I'm simply showing you that the picture may be larger than you've been calculating." "You've been calculating too," he said. "I have been," she admitted. He looked at the creek for a moment, and then at the leafless cottonwoods, and then at the woman sitting beside him who was in the process of reorienting everything he thought he knew about how the future might look. "I would like," he said carefully, "to speak to you about something more permanent than just the land." "I hoped you might," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very certain. He turned to face her fully. He didn't have a ring, which he was aware of and which bothered him more than he let show. He intended to remedy that as soon as any jeweler in any town within traveling distance could be reached, but for now he had only what he had, which was the truth. "Violet Ford," he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life with you if you'll have me. I'm aware I'm asking this on a creek bank in February with no ring and insufficient ceremony, and I intend to do the whole thing properly as soon as I can, but I've waited long enough to ask the question, and I don't want to wait any longer." She laughed, and it was a bright sound in the winter quiet, full and genuine, and then she said, "Yes, Tobias Quinn. I will absolutely have you." He kissed her again, there on the creek bank, and this time there was no starlight, but there was clear winter sun and the sound of the water and the certainty of someone who has arrived at a place they had not known they were traveling toward but recognize immediately upon arrival. The ring came from a jeweler in Tucson, simple and honest, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone the color of the Arizona sky, and when he put it on her finger on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks later, he thought there was no possible objection to it, from anyone, including himself. The town of Sagebrush Creek, which had seen most things in its short existence, received the news of the engagement with general approval and something approaching collective satisfaction. Mrs. Greenway, where Tobias boarded, put a special dinner on the table that evening without being asked. The brothers Castro, who were still in Benson at the mines but had passed through the previous month and met Violet, sent their congratulations via the mail rider. Even Ashford, the railroad surveyor, who had no particular investment in the matter, would later be told the story and say that he had entirely predicted it from the moment he'd seen them on the stagecoach. The land deal came through in April. The owner, an absent investor in Tucson who had taken the lot as part of a debt settlement and had no particular use for it, was persuaded to sell for a reasonable price that combined Tobias's savings from the cattle work and a portion of Violet's reserve. The line camp structure proved, upon inspection, to be better than expected, solid adobe with good walls, and a sound roof that needed only minor attention. There were 160 acres of decent ground with the creek cutting across the northeast corner, and the creek meant water, and water in the Arizona territory was as close to wealth as land could come. They were married on a Saturday in May, in the small church that Sagebrush Creek had recently acquired through the arrival of a Methodist minister named Reverend Aldous, who was young and enthusiastic and slightly overwhelmed by his new posting, but performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and evident genuine feeling. Violet wore her blue dress, the same one from the restaurant dinner, and she had flowers in her hair that she'd arranged herself, small yellow wildflowers from the creek bank, and Tobias wore a dark coat he'd bought in Tucson for the occasion, and thought he would probably have to be buried in, given the cost of it, but considered the investment justified under the circumstances. Chester Wills attended and sat in the front row and wept in an entirely undisguised way that no one mentioned to his face. Calloway came from the ranch and brought two of the hands who had gotten to know Tobias over the winter and spring. Mrs. Calderon from Benson had been invited and arrived by the morning stage, bringing with her enough food to feed the entire town, which was nearly what the post-ceremony celebration required. They had not invited a great many people because they did not know a great many people, and the celebration was small and honest, and exactly the right size for two people who preferred substance to performance. They danced in the open air outside the church as the afternoon turned to evening, a fiddle player from the saloon having been enlisted for the purpose, and Tobias danced with Violet in the gold of the late afternoon, and thought that, whatever he had been doing for the previous 26 years, it had all been the approach to this. They moved into the Line Camp house that weekend. The transition from the hotel and Mrs. Greenway's to an actual home of their own was an experience that he found difficult to describe but impossible to overvalue. The small rooms were theirs. The table was theirs. The particular quality of the light in the morning through the east-facing window was theirs to observe every day. Violet kept the store, because the store was her creation and her achievement, and she had no intention of abandoning it, and they worked out an arrangement that suited them. She ran the store during the week, and he ran the ranch operation, and they met in the evenings at the house, and on Sundays they did as they pleased, which was usually the creek and the cottonwoods and the ongoing conversation that had never actually stopped since it started in that store 2 years earlier. He hired 2 hands from Calloway's recommendation and began in earnest the business of building the cattle operation up from the small starting herd they'd bought. The work was familiar to him, hard and real and seasonal in its demands, and he was good at it in the way that some people are good at things that fit their particular nature, without effort or performance. Calloway gave him advice and occasional help with equipment, and the two of them developed a friendship of the reserved but solid kind that forms between men who respect each other's competence. Through the summer and into the fall, Sagebrush Creek continued its slow growth. The railroad survey came through the southern edge of the territory, and there was much discussion about what it would mean for commerce, about the possibility of a spur line, about the changes that always came with the iron road. Some of those changes were good and some were complicated, and some were simply the grinding of one world against another that was happening everywhere in the territory in those years. The Apache Wars were not distant, even in 1879, even in a town as far from the active conflict as Sagebrush Creek, and there were weeks when the news coming through on the mail rider was enough to make everyone in town more quiet and more careful. Tobias had his opinions about the injustice of what was being done to people who had lived in the territory for generations, opinions formed not from politics, but from seeing with his own eyes the effects of it in his travels, and he and Violet discussed it on the creek bank with the seriousness it deserved. She had her own clear-eyed understanding of it, and they agreed that the territory's future was being built on ground that was not as clean as the promotional pamphlets from the eastern cities wanted to make it. But the immediate life in front of them was good and demanded their attention, and they gave it fully. In the spring of the following year, the spring of 1880, Violet told him on a Tuesday evening in March, with the matter-of-fact calm that was entirely her, that she was expecting a child. He was in the process of washing up at the basin when she said it, and he stood absolutely still for approximately 3 seconds, with water dripping from his hands, before he turned around and looked at her. She was watching him with that amber-eyed reading of fine print, gauging his response. "When?" he asked. "Autumn," she said. "October, probably." He crossed the room and put his arms around her, still with somewhat damp hands, and held her with the particular care that comes not from thinking her fragile but from thinking the moment precious. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very well," she said into his shoulder. "A little tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely well." "You're sure?" "Tobias," she said with fond exasperation. "I'm sure." He held her for a long moment. Outside the window, the spring desert was doing its brief and extravagant flowering, the ocotillo in bloom and the prickly pear putting out its yellow flowers, and the light was that particular clear April gold that made everything look like something important was happening. Something important was, in fact, happening. "I'll send a letter to your mother," he said. "I've already written it," she said. "I mailed it yesterday." "Of course you did," he said, and she laughed. The pregnancy proceeded with the general health and straightforwardness that characterized Violet's approach to most things she set herself to. She worked in the store through the summer, adjusting arrangements as needed, recruiting a young woman named Esperanza who was 17 and sharp and quick to learn, to help with the heavier work and the stocking. She was not a woman who sat down when standing was possible or rested when there was something to be done, and he tried not to hover, because hovering was not something she appreciated, and he was mostly successful at this, except for certain evenings when the day had been long and she looked tired, and he would suggest, with studied casualness, that the accounts could probably wait until morning. She usually agreed, which was how he knew she was genuinely tired. Their son was born on an October morning in 1880, delivered by the town's doctor, a capable man named Hargrove, the same family whose cattle had been lost to the hard winter 2 years before, and who had subsequently retrained himself as a physician from the medical books he'd ordered from St. Louis, because the territory needed them, and he was the sort of man who responded to need with action. The birth was not without difficulty, as births rarely were, and those were the longest hours of Tobias Quinn's life, sitting in the outer room of their house while inside Violet did the enormous and extraordinary thing she was doing, and the sound she made reached him, and there was absolutely nothing he could do but wait and believe. When Dr. Hargrove opened the door and said that Violet and the baby were both well, Tobias Quinn, who had ridden through thunderstorms on the Llano Estacado and faced road agents in a mountain pass, and done the hard work of the territory for years without showing much of the interior of himself, sat down in his chair and covered his face with his hands, and was not presentable for approximately 2 minutes. The boy was named James William Quinn, James for Tobias's lost brother and William for Violet's father, and he arrived in the world with considerable opinions about his circumstances, which he expressed loudly and at length. He had dark hair that was clearly from his father and amberish eyes that leaned toward his mother, and he was, in Tobias's careful assessment, the most remarkable person he had ever encountered, which he understood to be an assessment made by every father and was still entirely true. Violet's mother, Margaret Ford, made the journey from Missouri in November to meet her grandson, and she was a small, sharp-eyed woman who had clearly produced her daughter from the full fund of her own considerable intelligence and forthright character. She stayed for 6 weeks, which was longer than originally planned, and during that time she reorganized Violet's kitchen to an improved layout, had several conversations with Tobias that were effectively job interviews for the position of son-in-law, and gave her verdict on the Arizona territory as harsh but not without merit, which Tobias suspected was the warmest praise she gave to most things. She loved James with an extravagance that was in complete contrast to her general reserve about everything else, and when she left in December to return to Missouri, she held Tobias's hand with both of hers and said, "You take care of my daughter," in a tone that made clear this was a standing instruction rather than a one-time request. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Always." She nodded as if that was the correct answer, which it was. The years settled into the good rhythms of a built life. The cattle operation grew steadily, and by 1882 they had acquired an additional 40 acres along the creek from a neighbor who decided to move north, bringing the property to 200 acres of good productive land. He hired a third hand and built a proper bunkhouse for the operation, solid adobe in the same style as the main house, which had by now been extended twice to accommodate the necessities of a growing household. The store continued to flourish under Violet's management, expanding the lending library to nearly 200 volumes and eventually adding a corner that carried a selection of the illustrated papers from back east, which proved enormously popular and which she refreshed every time the supply wagon came through. Esperanza had become indispensable to the operation and was being paid a real wage that reflected it, which was Violet's principle from the beginning. If someone's work was worth having, it was worth paying for properly. James Quinn, at 2 years old, was a determined explorer of every surface within his reach and several that were theoretically beyond it. At 3, he was asking questions about everything he observed with the relentless investigative interest of a person who has just discovered that the world contains information. His father taught him to ride on a patient old mare named Duchess when he was 4, and from the first moment James sat in the saddle, he had the easy seat of someone born to it. In the winter of 1883, Violet told Tobias that James was going to have a sibling. She told him in the same matter-of-fact way she'd told him the first time, on an evening in the kitchen after supper while he was reviewing the accounts and she was mending a shirt, and he looked up from the ledger and saw the expression on her face that told him it was true even before she said the words. "September this time," she said. He got up from the table and came around to her and took her hands, which were holding the shirt and the needle, and he looked at her with all of what he felt showing very clearly in his face, because he'd learned over the years that she preferred him visible, that she'd always read him well and appreciated it when he allowed himself to be read. "Good," he said. "That's very good." She smiled at him with the unguarded smile, the full one, and it still did to him everything it had always done, had not diminished by 1 unit across the years. Their daughter arrived in September of 1883, as predicted, smaller than James had been, and with a quiet intensity to her observation of the world from the very first hours that suggested she was already planning something. She had Violet's amber eyes and Tobias's dark hair, and a particular set to her jaw that belonged to both of them. They named her Clara, for Violet's bay mare who had carried her faithfully across the territory, and who was still, at 12 years old, the most sensible animal in the paddock. James, who was 3 years old and had been briefed extensively on the concept of a sibling, received Clara with a serious and proprietary concern that made both his parents try not to laugh in his presence. He appointed himself her guardian with the gravity of someone undertaking an important commission, and this guardianship persisted, in various evolving forms, for the entirety of their childhoods. The years continued to give them the particular texture of a life that is full without being overwhelming, and difficult without being unmanageable. The cattle work had its hard seasons and its good ones. The store had years when the supply chains were disrupted, and years when everything flowed smoothly. The territory was changing around them, the railroad finally coming through in 1881 and changing the commerce of the entire region, bringing faster supply lines and faster news, and a whole new category of people passing through. Sagebrush Creek changed with the territory, growing from its small beginning to something that warranted 2 doctors now, and a school, and a proper post office, and eventually a small courthouse. The school was something Violet had advocated for aggressively, attending the town meetings and making the argument with the methodical clarity she brought to everything she believed in. And when it was built, she donated 20 books from the store's library to its shelves as its founding collection. Old Chester Wills, who had observed and commented upon the early stages of the Quinn courtship from his various posts around town, died peacefully in the winter of 1882 at the age of 78, and the town observed a day of general quiet that was understood by everyone who had lived there any length of time to be an acknowledgment that a certain quality of observation would be missed. Tobias and Violet attended the service, and Tobias said, quietly, in the pew, that the man deserved some credit for persistence, and Violet said, equally quietly, that she had always thought he would make a terrible poker player, which was not what he'd expected her to say, and which made him cover his mouth to keep the inappropriate laughter from escaping in church. And Violet's shoulders shook slightly in the way they did when she was doing the same thing. By 1885, James Quinn was 5 years old and attending the new school with the enthusiasm of someone who wanted to know everything that was in it. And Clara was 2 years old and had opinions about her shoes that she communicated with remarkable clarity for someone without much language yet. Tobias was 33 years old and Violet was 30, and the ranch was profitable, and the store was thriving, and the house had been extended to 4 proper rooms plus a kitchen and a small study where Violet kept the accounts, and the books she was particularly fond of, and Tobias occasionally sat in the evenings with the day's last cup of coffee. It was in the study, on an October evening in 1885, that Violet said to him, "I want to talk to you about San Francisco." He looked up from the book he was reading. She was at her desk with the lamp light on her face, and she had that particular expression she got when she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided it was time to say it. "All right," he said. "I've been writing to my cousin Elaine for the past year," she said. "The one who lives there. She says the city is extraordinary now, nothing like the accounts I used to read. The cable cars run on 3 lines. The harbor is full of ships from China and Japan and South America. There's a public library that has 4,000 books." She paused. "She says we should come visit." He looked at her steadily. "You want to go?" "I do," she said. "I've wanted to for a long time, and now there's a railroad, which means it's possible in a way it wasn't before." She met his eyes. "I think we should take the children." He considered this. James was 5, which was old enough to remember a journey. Clara was 2, which was young but not impossibly so. The ranch could be managed for several weeks by his senior hand, a capable man named Ruiz who'd been with him for 4 years and ran things with Tobias's complete confidence. The store Esperanza could handle, who was now 23 and had more or less been running it jointly with Violet for the past 2 years. "How long?" he asked. "A month," she said. "There and back with 2 weeks in the city." He thought about it for the space of one reasonable breath and then said, "When do you want to leave?" The expression that came over her face was one of the most purely happy things he'd ever seen. They left in March of 1886, taking the Southern Pacific from Tucson westward through the desert and into California, and the journey itself was extraordinary enough to constitute its own adventure. James sat at the train window for approximately 18 of the 24 hours between Tucson and Los Angeles, with his nose pressed against the glass, cataloging everything that passed, the Sonoran Desert giving way to the California valleys and the orange groves, and eventually the glimpse of the Pacific Ocean that made him go so completely silent that Tobias and Violet exchanged a look over his head. "It's very large," James said finally, with the measured understatement of someone whose father had passed on the habit. "It is," his father agreed gravely. Clara, being 2, had strong opinions about the train's movement, but fell asleep against her mother's shoulder for most of the overnight portion, and arrived in Los Angeles with the confidence of someone who had managed the journey without significant incident. San Francisco surpassed, in Violet's accounting, every description she had ever read of it. They stayed with cousin Elaine, who was a lively and irreverent woman of 35 who lived in a tall Victorian house on a hill and had adopted the city's electric energy as her personal climate. She took them everywhere: the cable cars and the Embarcadero and the markets in Chinatown and the parks and the public library, which was indeed as magnificent as advertised, and in which Violet stood very still for a moment after they walked in, looking at the shelves rising to the ceiling, and Tobias watched her face and saw something in it that was the fulfillment of a very old longing. He put his hand on her back, and she leaned against him slightly without looking away from the books, and he thought that this was one of those moments that would remain whole and complete in his memory for the rest of his life. They rode a cable car up the steepest of the hills, and they walked along the bay watching the ships come in from their improbable distances, and they ate food unlike anything the Arizona Territory had ever offered, and James talked to everyone who would stand still long enough and asked questions about everything he saw, and Clara discovered a categorical preference for seagulls that she expressed with decisive pointing whenever one appeared. On their last evening in the city, Elaine insisted on a proper restaurant dinner on the waterfront, and they sat at a long table by the windows with the bay lights reflecting in the dark water, and Violet wore her blue dress, the same dress she'd worn to their first proper dinner in Sagebrush Creek, and to their wedding, let out slightly now at the waist to account for the years, but still the same deep color that he'd always thought suited her beyond all others. "I want to tell you something," she said across the table, while the children were occupied with an elaborate bread roll investigation. "Tell me," he said. "I thought when I was younger that I wanted to get away," she said. "From Missouri, from smallness, from being known before I decided who I was. And then I went to Sagebrush Creek and built the store and built a life there, and I thought that was the answer to it. And it was, in a way." She paused. "But I think the real answer, the one I didn't have words for when I was younger, was just this. Not a place. This." She gestured not quite at the restaurant, not quite at the city, but at the whole of the table and the people at it, and the particular arrangement of circumstances that had produced this moment. "You, James, Clara, a life that moves and grows and has room for things like this trip." He reached across the table and took her hand. James, who was 4 inches into an investigation of his bread roll and not paying attention to his parents, did not observe this. Clara saw it and pointed at their joined hands and said there with great conviction, which was unclear in its specific meaning but felt entirely appropriate. "I'm glad you didn't stay in Missouri," he said. "I'm glad you bought that stagecoach ticket," she said. He raised his eyebrows. "You knew." "Tobias," she said, with that particular fond precision she had used on him for 7 years, "there was one seat left on that stage. You told me yourself you'd planned to ride to Benson. You bought a ticket that you did not need to sit beside a woman you had not seen in 14 months. That's more or less accurate," he said. "It is entirely accurate," she said, "and I want you to know that I am very glad you did." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had read him from the beginning and never once used what she found there against him, who had built a real life from nothing, and then shared it with him without losing a single essential thing of herself in the sharing, who argued clearly and loved fully and ran an honest business, and raised their children with the same clear intelligence she brought to everything she did. "I would have bought the last seat on any stagecoach going anywhere," he said, "if you were going to be on it." She smiled at him. The bay lights moved on the water. The children continued their investigations, James having graduated to comparing his bread roll to Clara's and Clara defending hers with appropriate firmness. The city moved and hummed around them, alive with everything it was and everything it was becoming, and Tobias Quinn held his wife's hand across a restaurant table in San Francisco, and thought that a man who had spent most of his life in motion, drifting from one job to the next without a fixed destination, had finally arrived somewhere that was not a place on a map. He had arrived, as it turned out, in the company of a woman who read fine print and kept excellent accounts and dreamed about libraries, and the arrival was permanent, and the coordinates were hers. They went home to Sagebrush Creek in April, and the town received them back in the way that small towns receive people who have been away long enough to have something to report, with interest and with the particular warmth of belonging that is the best thing a community can offer. Mrs. Greenway, who had moved next door to the school and become something of an unofficial grandmother to the pupils there, heard about the San Francisco trip from James within an hour of their return, and asked him 16 questions that he answered with complete seriousness and a considerable recall. Esperanza had run the store so competently in Violet's absence that there was very little to catch up on, and Violet looked over the accounts and the records and told her plainly that she was raising her wage and offering her a formal partnership in the store, and Esperanza took this in with the quiet dignity of someone who had known for a while that it was earned and had simply been waiting for it to be named. Ruiz had managed the ranch with equal competence, having dealt with a minor fence issue on the north boundary and a difficult calving that had been successfully resolved, and Tobias looked over the situation and told him something similar, that his position was permanent and his wage was going up, and the arrangement they had was one that would continue as long as both parties wanted it. The summer of 1886 was hot and dry in the way that Arizona summers invariably were, and the cattle work was hard, and the store was busy with the increased traffic the railroad was bringing through the territory, and James started his second year of school and developed a specific passion for arithmetic that seemed to come from nowhere, but was probably, in retrospect, from exactly the right combination of parents. Clara at 3 was becoming the kind of person she would evidently be for the rest of her life, observant, precise, and formidable. She had very clear ideas about how things should be and communicated them with an articulate efficiency that was somewhat startling in a 3-year-old. Tobias told Violet one evening that he was slightly afraid of their daughter, and Violet said she thought that was probably healthy, which he could not argue with. That winter, Violet's mother Margaret came again from Missouri, this time for a longer visit, having decided that the journey was worth making annually since she was getting older, and the grandchildren were getting older and time was the one resource that could not be replaced once spent. She arrived in December with 3 trunks, a box of books for James, and a small embroidered blanket she had made for Clara, and she settled into the extended house with the air of someone who knows where she fits and has no intention of being anything other than exactly herself. She and Tobias had achieved, by this point, an understanding that was genuine and mutual. He respected her intelligence and her directness and her love for Violet, and she respected his work and his character, and the fact that he had made her daughter genuinely happy, which was the one thing she had most wanted for her daughter and had been most afraid she might not see. She was 62 years old and healthy for it, and she played cards with remarkable competence and told stories about Missouri in the old days with a narrative skill that held both children rapt. Margaret stayed through February, and when she left in the early spring of 1887, she held Tobias by both hands again at the stage platform in Sagebrush Creek, which now had its own direct connection to the Benson line, and said, "You have done well, Tobias Quinn," in the tone of someone delivering a verdict that has been considered over a long period of time and is now final. "Thank you, Mrs. Ford," he said. "Margaret," she said firmly. She had been saying this for 3 years, and he had been taking slightly longer to implement it than she preferred. "Margaret," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and climbed into the stage. He stood on the platform and watched it go, and then he turned and found Violet beside him, James on one side of her and Clara on the other, and the 4 of them watched the stage carry Margaret Ford back toward Tucson and the railroad beyond. "She calls you Margaret now," Violet observed. "It only took 3 years," he said. She took his hand. Around them, Sagebrush Creek went about its morning business. A wagon being loaded outside the general store, 2 men discussing something in front of the new courthouse, the school bell ringing 2 blocks over to call in the morning students. The desert air was clean and cool, and the creek made its sound somewhere beyond the buildings, and the cottonwoods were coming back to their leaves with the early spring, that particular new green that appeared for only a few weeks before the summer turned everything else. Tobias Quinn stood in the morning of his 35th year on the earth, and held his wife's hand and watched his town go about its life, and felt the particular quality of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of certainty. He was certain of her. He was certain of the children. He was certain of the work and the house and the 160+ acres that had been made into something real from a line camp and a borrowed future. He had come back to this town on a stagecoach ticket he didn't need, for a woman who read fine print and kept her own counsel, and had been hoping he'd come back, though she'd never have said so until there was ground to say it on. He had sat beside her on that dusty, jolting coach through the desert, their shoulders in accidental and not entirely accidental contact, and talked the way they had always talked, and told the truth when there was truth to tell, and the rest had followed in the way that things follow when the foundation is honest. The last seat on the Tucson to Benson stagecoach had been the best $4 he'd ever spent. He looked at Violet, who was still watching the direction the stage had gone, one hand holding his and the other resting on James's shoulder. She turned and found him looking, and understood the look in the way she always understood it, fully and without translation required. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She gave him the full smile, the unguarded one, and he held it in his mind the way you hold something that you know to be irreplaceable, with the careful and grateful awareness that you are, right now, in the presence of the best of your life. James tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Can we have breakfast? Ruiz said there was bacon." "There is bacon," Tobias confirmed, because Ruiz was the sort of man who made good on his promises. "Then let's go," said James Quinn, who had his father's directness and his mother's certainty, and started walking toward home without waiting for further discussion. Clara, who had been observing all of this from her position at Violet's other side with the expression she had inherited from no one specifically but had produced entirely herself, said, "Bacon," with the gravity of a final verdict, and also started walking. Tobias and Violet followed their children down the street of Sagebrush Creek in the clean spring morning, hand in hand, and the town went about its life around them, and the creek ran clear over its stones, and the cottonwoods put out their new leaves in the light, and the desert held them in its ancient, indifferent, beautiful keeping, and everything was exactly as it should be and would be for all the long good years ahead.